She was tightening the last bolt on the nose gear when she heard the commotion up in the cockpit. A voice shouted for medical. The captain had collapsed, and there wasn't a pilot left on board who could take the plane out of danger. Welcome to Coveralls Stories, cinematic tales of courage, resilience, and the moments that change everything. These stories are fictional, created to inspire and move you. Where in the world are you watching from? Tell us in the comments your stories. The pre-dawn air clung cool and damp to the skin, heavy with the tang of jet fuel drifting in from the far end of the tarmac. Tower lights blinked like slow metronomes, their reflections pooling in the slick patches of asphalt left from last night's rain. The distant rumble of taxiing aircraft rolled through the ground like low thunder. Torres crouched beside the nose gear of Flight 782, a Boeing 737-800 bound for Boston. She had one knee braced against the slick concrete, the other bent to give her leverage as she leaned into the wrench. The steel bolt resisted at first, then yielded with the familiar, satisfying shift under torque. She checked the gauge on her torque wrench, adjusted, then double-checked, because that's what professionals did, even when it was the 1,000th time. Above her, the belly of the aircraft loomed, its curved aluminum skin glowing faintly under the floodlights. The landing gear, with its hydraulic lines and heavy tires, smelled faintly of rubber and hot oil. To most people, this was just machinery. To Mia, it was a living system, one she understood better than almost anyone else on the ramp. She pulled back, resting on her heels for a moment. From where she knelt, she could see the forward tug idling 100 feet away, its driver sipping coffee, waiting for the ready signal from the cockpit. The boarding bridge was already retracted. Passengers were settled in, seatbelts fastened, oblivious to the dance of checklists and coordination happening outside. Mia wiped her hands on the rag tucked into her coveralls. Her watch read 05:43, 12 minutes to scheduled pushback. Inside the cockpit, the captain and first officer were running through their pre-flight procedures. Soon, they'd call for chocks out, and Mia would clear the tug to roll them back toward the taxiway. She was halfway through stowing her tools in the maintenance kit when it happened. The sound wasn't loud, just a sudden clipped voice from inside the cockpit, sharp enough to cut through the steady background hum. She froze, head cocked toward the noise, trying to make out the words through the sealed glass. Another voice followed, louder this time, urgent. Then the side window cracked open with a metallic click. The first officer's head appeared, pale in the cold light. "We need medical, now!"
Mia dropped the rag without thinking. The tug driver turned at the shout, already reaching for his radio. She jogged toward the air stairs, boots thudding against the wet tarmac. Two flight attendants crowded the doorway. One was speaking rapidly into a handheld radio, her free hand clutching the frame for balance. The other waved frantically, eyes wide. "What happened?" Mia called, breath visible in the chill air. "The captain, he just collapsed. Chest pains, then nothing," the attendant replied, her voice trembling. Mia didn't ask permission. She bounded up the stairs, her palms skimming the cold metal rail, and stepped into the narrow forward galley. The air inside was warmer but thick with the faint ozone smell of active avionics. The first officer was half kneeling in the cockpit doorway, one hand braced on the seatback, the other supporting the captain's limp shoulder. The older man was slumped in his seat, headset dangling around his neck, eyes closed, breathing shallow and irregular. The soft chime of an altitude alert sounded from the instrument panel, ignored. "Paramedics are on the way," the first officer said without looking up. His voice was controlled, but Mia could hear the strain under it. He glanced at the overhead clock, then out toward the runway where the morning fog was thickening. Mia followed his gaze instinctively. She knew the forecast: low ceiling, marginal visibility, and a narrow departure window before conditions slipped below minimums. Miss that slot and they could be grounded for hours. Under normal circumstances, the weather was just an operational headache. But right now, with the captain unconscious and a cabin full of passengers, it was a trap tightening around them. "Can you take it out alone?" Mia asked quietly. The first officer shook his head, almost imperceptibly. "Not on this route. Company policy. Needs 2 type-rated in the cockpit for departure. Without him, we're stuck." The words were meant as a statement of fact, but they landed like a challenge. Because Mia wasn't just ground crew. Not always. Not in another life. Her license wasn't current, not officially, but her hands still remembered every control, every procedure. She glanced at the captain again, the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Out on the ramp, the tug driver was watching the stairs, radio pressed to his ear. Somewhere in the terminal, medics were threading their way toward the gate, but every second counted. For the man in the seat, for the weather window, for everyone strapped in behind the cockpit door. And there was no one else. No one except her. The whine of the avionics seemed louder in the cramped cockpit, as if the aircraft itself was aware of the tension pressing in from all sides. The first officer's headset cord hung loose, swaying slightly with each breath he took, his eyes darting between the unconscious captain and the overhead panel where the pre-flight checklist had stalled mid-procedure.
Mia stayed just inside the cockpit door, one hand on the frame, the other braced on the bulkhead. She could feel the faint hum of the systems through her fingertips, that low, steady vibration that had been her world, years before she traded it for wrenches and hydraulic lines. "His pulse?" she asked quietly. The first officer nodded once. "Weak, but it's there. We need to get him off this aircraft as soon as the medics arrive." Mia's gaze flicked to the forward windows. Beyond them, the fog was sliding across the taxiway like a living thing, curling around the bright cones of the runway lights. She knew weather like this didn't wait. It closed in, fast and final, until all you had left was delay codes and angry passengers. The first officer caught her looking. "Even if we could depart, we'd never make the slot now, not without him." "Not unless someone else took the seat," Mia said before she could stop herself. He blinked, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face. Someone else. She met his gaze evenly. "I've been type-rated on the 737. Sat in that seat for over 1,000 hours." The suspicion deepened into guarded curiosity. "That's not on your ground crew file." "It wouldn't be," Mia replied, her voice flat. "I walked away a long time ago." The first officer studied her for a long beat, the faint hum of the equipment filling the space between them. He wasn't doubting her. She could see it in his eyes. He was calculating. "Why?" he asked, finally. Mia didn't answer right away. She let her gaze drop to the captain, the man's breathing shallow but steady, his skin pale under the cockpit lights. There were a dozen reasons she could give, reasons about policy, about life getting in the way, but the real one was messier, tangled in events she had no intention of unpacking here. "Doesn't matter," she said at last. "Right now you've got an aircraft, a weather window closing, and a seat you can't fill." His jaw tightened. "And you're telling me you could get us airborne?" "I'm telling you I know the systems, the checklists, the flows. I can run the right seat or the left, but you'll have to decide if you want to risk it." Before he could respond, a burst of static cracked through the overhead speakers, followed by the clipped voice of the gate agent. "Medics are en route, 3 minutes out." 3 minutes. By then, the captain would be on a stretcher, the cabin crew would be in scramble mode, and the flight would be officially grounded. The first officer turned in his seat, really looking at her now. "This isn't protocol." "No," Mia agreed. "It's survival."
He didn't move for a long moment. Then, With a low breath, he reached forward and began shutting down the left seat systems, not completely, but enough to hand control to another pilot. His movements were precise, deliberate, but Mia could hear the change in his breathing. "You take the right," he said quietly. "We'll run the checklists from the top as soon as the medics clear the cockpit." It wasn't permission so much as acknowledgement. Mia stepped forward, her boots sounding heavier than they should against the metal deck. She slid into the right seat, her hands finding the armrests automatically. The smell of heated electronics and worn leather hit her instantly, triggering muscle memories she thought she'd buried for good. Her fingers hovered over the familiar array of switches and knobs, each one exactly where her hands remembered. "You've got this?" the first officer asked, his tone still cautious, but now threaded with something else: hope. She glanced at him, her mouth set in a hard line. "Just tell me the route clearance and the SID. The rest is muscle memory." Outside, the flashing beacons of the approaching ambulance painted the fog in brief washes of red. The cabin crew's voices carried faintly from behind the cockpit door, quick and urgent. The first officer keyed his mic, requesting a temporary hold from ground control, buying them seconds they didn't really have. Mia's hands moved without hesitation, setting up displays, adjusting comms, scanning the FMC. The years fell away, replaced by the same calm focus she'd carried on every climb-out, every approach, every night she'd flown into storms darker than this one. She wasn't back. Not yet. But the aircraft didn't care about her past. It only cared that someone was at the controls who knew what to do when the clock was running out. And Mia Torres had always known exactly what to do. The ambulance's red strobes pulsed through the fog, splashing light across the tarmac as the medics jogged toward the air stairs. Their boots slapped against wet metal, the clatter echoing up into the fuselage. The cabin crew moved instinctively, clearing the forward galley and guiding the team into the cockpit with short, urgent instructions. Mia kept her eyes forward, fingers resting on the edge of the instrument panel. She didn't need to watch. She could feel the shift in the space around her as the captain's seat was pulled back, as the medics leaned in to check vitals and secure him for transport. The cockpit was too small for this much motion, and every bump against the control column made her shoulders tense. "Pulse is steady," one medic announced, "but we're not risking it. He's coming off now." The first officer stepped aside, letting them work. He cast a quick glance at Mia, a silent question in his eyes. "You still sure?" She gave a single, sharp nod. It took less than 3 minutes for the medics to move the captain out. They secured him to the stretcher, oxygen mask in place, then disappeared down the air stairs in a blur of reflective stripes and medical gear. The sudden quiet after their departure felt almost unnatural, broken only by the low hum of the avionics. The first officer slid back into the left seat. "Tower's aware. They've given us 10 minutes to either taxi or stand down." Mia adjusted her harness straps, locking them into place. The right seat felt both foreign and achingly familiar. The curve of the yoke under her palm, the slight warmth of the displays, the faint vibration of power flowing through the systems. "You're ready for this?" he asked, flicking switches overhead. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't," she replied, scanning the overhead panel. Her hands moved in sync with his. Generators confirmed on. APU bleeds set for departure. The rhythm of the flows returned like muscle memory, slotting each motion into place without hesitation. Behind the closed cockpit door, the cabin crew was making announcements, a vague explanation about the delay, assurances that departure was still planned. The words would keep the passengers calm, but Mia knew every second was eating into their margin. The first officer keyed the radio. "Ground, November 372, ready for pushback. Request clearance." Static. Then, "November 372, cleared to Boston via the Charlie 6 departure. Climb and maintain 5,000, Expect flight level 370 10 minutes after departure. Pushback approved. Taxi via Alpha. Mia read the clearance back without needing to glance at the notes, her voice steady in the headset. The controller didn't even pause before moving to the next call. To them, she was just another voice in the sky. The tug driver gave a thumbs up from outside. Chocks were pulled, and the aircraft began its slow roll backward from the gate. The vibration of motion hummed up through the seat frame, a sensation that tightened something in my chest. Not fear, but the anticipation she'd almost forgotten. "Flaps 5?" the first officer said. "Flaps 5, Mia echoed, moving the lever. The hydraulic whir of the flaps deploying was a sound she'd heard thousands of times, but tonight it felt like an oath, a commitment to see this through. The tug disconnected, and they taxied forward under their own power. Taxiway rights shimmered in the fog, like a runway of blue stars. The first officer handled steering, his eyes flicking between the center line and the moving map display. Mia managed the radios and monitored engine parameters. Her scan flowed from EGTs to fuel flow to oil pressure without missing a beat. As they approached the hold short line for runway 27, tower came through again. November 372, wind 240 at 8. Runway 27 cleared for takeoff. Cleared for takeoff, runway 27, Mia confirmed, setting the transponder to TA/RA.
The first officer eased the aircraft onto the center line, nose straight, the runway lights stretching into a glowing corridor ahead. The fog at the far end seemed to swallow the world, but the landing lights cut deep, revealing just enough to trust. Mia's hand hovered over the thrust levers. "Your call." "Set takeoff thrust," he said. She pushed the levers forward in one smooth motion. The engines spooled up, their deep rise and roar vibrating through the deck and up into her bones. The acceleration pressed them into their seats, the centerline lights flashing faster in her peripheral vision. 80 knots, checked. V1, rotate. The first officer eased back on the yoke, and the nose lifted. The runway lights fell away beneath them, replaced by the soft glow of the city beyond the fog. The gear thumped into the whales as Mia retracted it, her voice calm over the intercom. They were airborne, against protocol, against odds, but in perfect control. Mia glanced at the altimeter climbing steadily. She wasn't supposed to be here, but every fiber of her being told her this was exactly where she belonged. The climb was smooth for the first few minutes, the engines purring in perfect rhythm as the Boeing 737 sliced through the thinning layers of fog. The sun was still well below the horizon, but the eastern edge of the sky had begun to pale, a promise of light that hadn't yet reached them. Mia monitored the instruments with a steady scan. N1 value steady, EGT in the green, fuel flow balanced. The autopilot clicked on with a muted thunk, taking some of the workload off the first officer's shoulders. For a moment, the cockpit settled into that familiar hum of a normal departure. Then, without warning, the master caution light blazed amber on the glare shield. A sharp tone cut through the cockpit. "Right pack trip off," Mia said instantly, reading the alert on the EICAS screen. Her voice was calm, but her eyes narrowed as she leaned in to confirm the bleed and temperature readings. The first officer glanced over. "Could just be a sensor." "Or a duct overheat," she replied, already pulling the QRH, the quick reference handbook, from its holder. The laminated pages were a comfort to her hands, the weight of them grounding her in procedure. "Pack reset. Off for 30 seconds, then back on." She reached for the switch, clicking the right pack off. The background hum of airflow shifted subtly. 30 seconds passed like eternity. She flicked it back on. The light snapped back immediately. Mia frowned. not a false trip. We've got an actual overtemp. Right pack stays off. The first officer nodded, adjusting the air conditioning flow to keep the cabin comfortable with one pack. But we can run on one,
But it means more load on the left pack, and less margin if it fails, Mia finished for him. She glanced at the cabin pressure display, still stable, for now. Below them, the city lights gave way to dark expanses of countryside, tiny pinpricks of scattered towns sliding past under their wings. The climb continued, but the pack issue was like a hairline crack in a pane of glass, small now, but capable of spreading if stressed. At 10,000 feet, Tower handed them off to center. Mia handled the radio, her voice steady, professional. But as soon as she released the transmit button, she looked over at the first officer. "We keep going, we're committed. Turn back now, we can get her on the ground before sunrise. Maintenance can swap the pack before the next cycle." He hesitated. "Weather's improving behind us, but Boston's expecting crosswinds by the time we'd get there. Decision point is 2 minutes from now." Mia's daze swept the instruments again. The numbers were steady, the aircraft flying like it was born to do it. But she'd seen too many flights tip from stable to chaos in less than the time it took to make a coffee. The first officer studied her. "What's your gut?" "Keep her climbing," she said. "We've got the load margin, but we watch it like a hawk. If the left pack so much as blinks, we divert immediately." He nodded once, the decision made. They pressed on, climbing through the last streaks of cloud. The light outside deepened from black to indigo, the first faint burn of dawn touching the horizon. In the cabin, passengers would be dozing, reading, or sipping coffee, unaware that the air they were breathing now came from a single operational system. Mia's hands rested lightly on the yoke, not because she needed to fly manually, but because the contact grounded her. This was what she knew. Scanning, anticipating, staying ahead of the machine. Every small change in tone, every shift in vibration was a language she still spoke fluently. At flight level 230, the pack temperature began creeping up. She noticed it before the alert did. "Left pack temps trending high," she said sharply. The first officer's eyes snapped to the display. "Bleed flow?" "Holding steady. Could be a control valve lagging," Mia said, already moving to adjust the mix. The numbers steadied, then dropped back into the green. The first officer exhaled slowly. "You still got it." Mia didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed forward, fixed on the pale line of horizon sharpening ahead. "I never lost it." Cruising altitude was still 15 minutes away when the headset crackled with a new voice, sharper, clipped in that way that told Mia it wasn't just routine ATC. "November 372, Boston Center. Amend route. Copy ready?" The first officer keyed his mic. "Go ahead for November 372.
Diverting you due traffic saturation. New vector, turn right heading 080, maintain flight level 280, proceed direct Wexon." Mia's head lifted. Wexon wasn't on their original flight plan, not even close. She glanced at the navigation display, watching as the magenta line shifted sharply east. Wexon was waypoint near a restricted airspace corridor, one she remembered from years ago for reasons she never expected to revisit. The first officer frowned at the change. "That's a big dogleg. Any reason for the deviation?" Sender's reply was bland, almost too smooth. "Traffic management. Expect further clearance after Wexon." Mia kept her face neutral, but inside she felt the old tension tightening. Traffic management was a plausible reason, but in her experience, big detours toward low-traffic corridors at this hour often meant something else. Rerouting for VIP movement, military exercises, or security incidents.
And if it was the third one, it could get complicated fast. Wexon, the first officer muttered, adjusting the flight plan in the FMC. Haven't flown over that sector in years. Mia's eyes stayed on the display as the new course came alive on the screen. Some things don't change. Weather's clean there. Airspace is usually quiet. She didn't mention that she also knew the strip of land below Wexon was the home of a decommissioned airbase, one she'd landed at once in a chapter of her life she'd sworn shut. The turn began, the soft bank pressing them lightly into their seats. The autopilot handled it with mechanical precision, the horizon tilting until the new heading settled under the lubber line. 5 minutes later, center called again. November 372, confirm he able to maintain speed 480 until Wexon. The first officer glanced at her. That was unusually fast for their stage of climb and fuel profile. Mia's hands were already adjusting thrust. We can do it, she answered before he keyed the mic. The engines responded with a deeper growl, the numbers on the airspeed tape creeping upward. The cabin would feel the change as a subtle push in their backs, maybe enough to make a few passengers glance out the windows in curiosity. Below them, the night was thinning into dawn. The thin gold seam of the horizon was widening, spilling muted light across the tops of scattered clouds. It should have been peaceful, but Mia's focus was locked on the instrument panel and the faint electric hum of the radios. She was listening for something that wasn't there yet. At exactly 10 miles from Wexon, the other voice arrived. Not center, not any civil frequency. Flight 372, confirm Echo Sierra 1 in right seat. The sound of that call sign made every muscle in her back tighten. Echo Sierra 1, her old operational designation. No one outside a small, now defunct unit should even know it existed. The first officer's head snapped toward her, confusion in his eyes. They mean you?
Mia reached for the radio switch, but hesitated just long enough to scan the transponder. The query had come through a secondary channel, piggybacked onto their ATC comm. Whoever it was, they weren't amateurs. This is November 372, she said evenly. Say again? Echo Sierra 1, the voice repeated, calm but unmistakably authoritative. Confirm you're receiving. The first officer mouthed the words silently. What is going on? Mia kept her tone flat. Receiving. There was a pause, just static, and then, maintain course to Wexon. Further instructions on handoff. Mission priority. The transmission cut, leaving nothing but the normal drone of center's traffic calls. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The first officer's hands were tight on the yoke, even with autopilot engaged. Care to explain? Not yet, Mia said, eyes locked on the nav display. Just fly the course. But inside, her mind was already racing. Someone had not only recognized her, but had clearance to pull her mid-flight into something off the books. The only question was whether it was a rescue, a test, or the beginning of something much more dangerous. Wexon slid beneath them in silence, nothing more than a blip on the navigation display and an invisible line in the cold air at flight level 280. The first officer acknowledged the next handoff from Boston Center, but I could tell he was only half listening. His eyes kept darting toward her, then back to the instruments, as if to expect an explanation to materialize on its own. November 372, contact guard frequency on 252.8, came the next instruction. Guard. That was the international emergency frequency, used for distress, intercepts, or military control. It wasn't something a civilian flight was told to dial without a damn good reason. The first officer looked at her, eyebrows raised. Mia keyed the switch herself. Guard frequency November 372. The reply was immediate, the voice crisp, controlled, and without any call sign of its own. Echo Sierra 1, you are cleared direct to Blackwell Field. Coordinates to follow. Maintain current altitude until instructed. Her gut clenched. Blackwell Field wasn't on any civilian charts, because officially it didn't exist. She'd been there once, years ago, flying in under a different name, on a mission that had ended with more questions than answers. "This is a scheduled passenger service," the first officer said sharply into his mic. "We have 162 souls on board. We can't—" "Captain Torres knows the field," the voice cut in, ignoring him entirely. "She will get you there. Instructions are non-negotiable." The cockpit went quiet, except for the hum of the avionics. The first officer's gaze locked on her. "Captain." Mia exhaled slowly. She hadn't heard anyone call me captain in years. "We divert," she said finally. "Route it in the FMC. And don't use the name again." His mouth opened to argue, but something in her tone stopped him cold. He started punching coordinates into the flight computer instead. The turn came gradually, but Mia felt it in her bones. Blackwell lay far from the airways, a strip of tarmac carved into a valley, flanked by ridges that funneled wind like a barrel. No ILS, no published approach. You either knew how to get in, or you didn't get in at all. 20 minutes out, the guard voice returned. "Echo Sierra 1, reduced to 250 knots, descend flight level 120, expect visual." The descent had them dropping into layered cloud, the sun vanishing again as gray swallowed the cockpit windows. Rain streaked sideways across the glass, and turbulence began to nibble at the wings. Mia handled the radios, but she was already adjusting her mental picture: terrain, wind shear possibilities, the narrow threshold she remembered too well. "Any reason you can't tell me what's going on?" the first officer asked, voice tight. "Because the less you know, the better for you. Trust me on this one," she replied without looking up from the approach settings. At 6,000 feet, the ridgelines broke through the mist, dark, jagged, and far too close. The rain turned to sleet, pinging against the windshield. The valley ahead opened just wide enough to suggest there might be a runway hiding in its depths. "There," Mia said, pointing. A strip of asphalt barely visible through the shifting veils of weather. The windsock at the far end stood stiff and straight, pointing a crosswind that would punish any mistake. The first officer's hands were firm on the controls, but Mia could feel the tension in his movements. "You've done this before?" "Once. Night. Worse weather." "Great," he muttered. They came in low, gear down, flaps to 30. The sleet smeared across the lights, each flash of the strobes illuminating the valley walls crowding in. The crosswind shoved at the fuselage, but Mia's calm voice called corrections like she was reading from a script. "Hold your drift. Now ease her left. There you go. Power steady. Flare in 3, 2. The tires kissed wet asphalt with a mudded thump, the nose settling a heartbeat later. Reverse thrust roared, the spray hammering the belly of the aircraft. The runway lights raced past, and then they were rolling slow enough for the turnoff, a single taxiway leading toward a cluster of hangars that looked abandoned. Ground control never came on frequency. Instead, the guard voice spoke again. "Taxi to hangar 3. Engines off. Leave cockpit last." The first officer shot her a look that was equal parts disbelief and curiosity, but he followed instructions. Passengers were told there would be a short, unscheduled stop due to operational requirements. The cabin crew kept them calm, though their eyes were full of questions. As the last of the passengers stepped down into the waiting buses, unmarked, white, windows tinted, Mia stayed seated, headset resting on the glare shield. Outside, figures in dark rain gear stood just beyond the wash of the wing lights, watching. When the cabin was clear, she rose, unbuckled, and slung her headset over the seatback. The first officer caught her arm. "You're going to tell me someday, right?" She paused in the doorway, the smell of rain and cold metal drifting in. Only if you ever need to land here again. Then she stepped down into the wet dark, walking toward the hangar and whatever ghosts had decided to call her back.